Hi, everyone. Welcome to the International Institute of Genealogical Studies, found at genealogicalstudies.com. My name is Angie Breidenbach. I'm the executive director here, and we have a very special guest with us that's going to help us learn all about Dominican Republic and maybe a little bit of Caribbean genealogy. His name is Gerald Lopez, and he is going to be unraveling histories through genetic genealogy in the Dominican Republic. Come learn a little bit about Dominican genealogy with a genetic flair. He is a genetic genealogist that specializes in the Dominican Republic, and he's driven by a passion of combining the layers of history, genealogy, and personal genomics. This passion was brewed into him early on as he gravitated toward family historians. He immersed himself in the Dominican Republic, Caribbean, and African diasporic histories. And combining this with his tech background has allowed him to interpret and present individual histories through his service called BUSCAFAMILY. Did I pronounce all that correctly?
Yep.
Thank you, Gerald. I'm going to go ahead and put the camera on you. You go ahead and share your screen. And we're just thrilled to have you.
Thank you, Angela. So I will go ahead and share my screen now. So the first thing is the name of the service is Busca Family. It's a bit of a Spanglish situation because Busca is find in Spanish and family is obviously in English. And the idea is because a lot of people both in the island in the Dominican Republic and in the diaspora are looking a lot of times for the roots and looking for their origins. And some people who are hobbyists do get really knee deep, as I did when I started, right? And a lot of us genetic genealogists do. And some people really want to learn, but they don't either have the time or don't want to take the approach necessarily. But I mean, we're all here to learn. And as part of the service, one of the first things is what is our mission, right? In like when we do Dominican genealogy. We're a genetic genealogy service that focuses on the genealogy of the Dominican Republic using interdisciplinary approach to documentation and research. The interdisciplinary part is very important when it comes to Dominican genealogy because you might build out a tree, right, and get far, but you need to tie in everything as far as the historical events that are shaping, because some parts won't make sense. You might say, for example, why is somebody from the west side of the island all of a sudden in the north side of the island in 1825? Or why do I have an ancestor, for example, from Ireland, right? Were the Irish allowed in the Dominican Republic, even though it was not uh, it was not that was not a common thing to see, but things, for example, that shape events and movements will tie into the history. And also, we have the genetic analysis, right, which is the real, the interpretation of the genome is happening at the DNA companies where you guys take a test, whether that's 23andMe, FTDNA, MyHeritage, Ancestry. And what I do in my interpretations is to try to piece that together with the genealogy, right? This is what genetic genealogy is, and that is a universal concept. Now, how that applies into, or maybe differentiates a little bit, but not completely, because this exists in many other populations, uh, it has a lot to do with endogamy. So, in the case of Dominican genealogy, here's an example of a tree. This is actually my tree. Uh, and going back from my great grandmother over to my fifth great grandfather, Pedro Maiz, uh, which later got transfigured into Mai, is actually a native of France, of Paris, which was where we have the French flag all the way at the top left. And this individual, my ancestor, immigrates, and very luckily, he leaves a will before he dies, where he says, "I am a natural," which means in Catholic wills that that person is born there. I am a natural of Paris, France, and my wife is Francisca Hernandez, and he names his kids, right? And I was able to work through that and find that we're all descendants from his daughter. He had three sons who don't appear genealogically; they could appear genetically, but that puzzle would have to be solved with genetic genealogy, and I would have to find somebody who is either a paternal, a relative of Pedro Maiz, or using triangulation. want somebody in France to see. Now, uh, interestingly, this line, I was able to dig through it as much as possible and get. Now, you're going to notice that there are going to be some, and this is a bit common in Dominican genealogy. There is sometimes gaps with the fathers because most of our genealogy is strongly based on Catholic Church records, right? And Catholic Church records omit the father whenever the couple was not married. Unless the father formally recognized, and usually that would mean that he would have to be of a certain socioeconomic background to recognize the children. Not always, but I noticed that quite often. In Dominican genealogy, there can be gaps. There can be gaps in the fathers sometimes, and this is where the genetic part really ties in really nicely because genetically genealogy helps you investigate and give closure and sort of color and fill in some of these brick walls that are there. Now, another thing that I have to mention is the patterns in each town. And this is where sort of my experience being on the ground. I was born in the U.S., but I was raised in the Dominican Republic to Dominican parents, and I spent a lot of my life there, and I go back all the time. So when you're kind of there, like on the ground in the battlefield, you're like, oh, this makes sense now, like, and that. So the sort of local patterns are very, very important into how people tie into your tree as well. And as I mentioned earlier, with the endogamy, analyzing the genetic matches, it can be a little bit challenging for some because the endogamy is both willing and unwilling in the Dominican Republic, which means that some people did choose to marry relatives, and some people don't know that they're marrying relatives, right? Because down the line, I mean, just to give you a quick, anybody who's really good at math, I mean, the Dominican Republic was a population in the year 1800 flat of about 100,000 people, and we're about 11.5 million today with very little external immigration. So we didn't have waves of people coming in from Europe or West Africa or Asia as in the after the country was formed. During slavery and during historical period when Spain owned the island, we did have people come in both willingly and unwillingly, but uh, we had a very kind of like small base which grew out, and this makes a lot of people related, usually more than one way. I'm related to my wife about 3 times already genetically. I found one genealogical line, but that's not definitely not the only one because I can see it through my other grandparents. These tend to be distant, but sometimes they're closer depending on the town, and this is where it can be a little bit tricky. I like to use it's sort of like in the countryside. Sometimes people say like it's a saying that old people say, like if somebody's, it's a bit of a violent saying, but if somebody comes at you with a machete, if you go against it, you're going to get cut. But if you go with it, you might just save your hand, right? And with endogamy, I like to take the approach to use it to my advantage in this case. And one of the greatest tools which I am an advocate for is DNA painters. I am a really huge advocate in DNA painter. It's one of the tools that we use the most in the interpretations, along with other tools that help, especially with the heavy endogamy, to sort of detangle things quite a bit. So DNA Painter, GenMatch, and depending on who you're testing in your family, for example, if the more people you test, especially in the older generations, it might be uh, one can sort of extrapolate more data and do something called phasing where you can separate the DNA between paternal and maternal. Ancestry actually does this. A lot of you who have taken Ancestry DNA test have the DNA uh, split between parents, and that's phasing via relatives instead of a via matches, essentially. So in this example, just to give you guys a little bit more of a visual, here's a really cool example of one thing that I found when I tested my late grandfather. I'm like, wait a minute. No, normally, Dominicans have certain patterns, usually in the within the Caribbean. For example, there's always native ancestry, West African ancestry, sometimes also South and Southeast African ancestry, South European ancestry, and also other European ancestry, whether that is Irish, Italian, sometimes Swedish. I found Greek as well. You get because just to give you guys right before I get into this, give you an administrative sort of insight into how the colony of Santo Domingo, which later became the Dominican Republic, works. This is a colony that at first was the first of everything in the Americas, right? So the first church, the first hospital, because this is the place where Columbus kind of said, you know what, I kind of like it here, and he sort of laid the foundation there. So the hype, kind of like it was almost like the startup of the Spanish Empire, if you want to call it that, and it had a lot of investment in the very first half of the 16th century, and that investment poofed out of nowhere because they found gold in Peru and they found much more money in other places. So this means we ended up being an abandoned colony to an extent, right? So we grew naturally, didn't have a lot of people coming in, not a lot of investment, not a lot of rules, sorry, not a lot of laws that were really applied necessarily. So a little bit lawless. Thankfully, the record survived for a lot of the towns, but within that lawlessness, we have a lot of missing records, wet records, burnt records, you know, cannon blasted records, etc. So back to to this approach here. Uh, this in this example, we have a Central and South Asian or a South Asian, Southern Indian segment, right? Which normally, from a historical perspective, there really isn't a history of South Asians immigrating into the Dominican Republic, albeit be in recent times, right? In recent times, there's everybody, we have a strong tourism economy, but in historical times, for the case of my grandfather, whose tree I have developed, this didn't make a lot of sense at first, right? So I'm like, why is there a South Asian segment? That's really cool and interesting. And the South Asian segment, since he's a man gets his X chromosome only from his mother. Effectively, I have a one-sided segment where everybody who's in this segment is related because you can only get the X from your mother. So this is not like the rest of the chromosomes. So in this example, South Asian is tying in. The first thing I started to notice is that he has Dominican relatives there. So I said, okay, let me trace these people to see exactly where we're related. I was able to find the connection, which is through our shared fifth grade grandparents in the same in our town of San Francisco de Macorís, Dominican Republic. So I was like, okay, I have the Dominican side done. I know where it's coming from. So the cool part, so then my next question was, how is this South Asian? Where do we have, how does this tie into history? And when it all started to click is when I got my first Romani relative from Spain. And he introduced himself, a very warm person, and we were talking through it and seeing how we were related. And that's when I started to dig into the research. And as I started doing that, more and more Romanis started to pop up from Albania, from Romania, and Bosnia. And I'm like, wait a minute, like this is a pretty clear pattern. They're all sharing South Asian ancestry. I also checked in GenMatch where you can check and mixer segments. And I was able to actually tie this all together. And I said, you know what? This is making sense. And when I started looking at the history, what made everything tied together was looking at the fact that many Romanis, as discriminated people at the time in Spain, were deported or expulsed from Spain and from Portugal. And the destiny was oftentimes Brazil or the Caribbean. And why or the Caribbean? Well, this is again where we go back to the lawlessness and kind of you see this a lot in like the movies about pirates in the Caribbean. But the DR is literally a free-for-all in most of its historic time periods. And the Portuguese would often, on their way to Brazil, pit stop in the Caribbean. And they'd say, I'm tired, I need water, I got to refuel. And within that refueling, they will let people off who maybe were not supposed to get off and enter the country. And among them were definitely Romanis, sometimes even people who were enslaved Africans and free merchants from West Africa who actually traveled to the Dominican Republic on these boats as well, which sometimes just stay. And you would have these lineages now form part of the population. So this example highlights that sort of like uh, uh, very unregulated borders. Um, and also on a again DNA painter. Shout out to Johnny Pearl. This is a great tool. Um, so here we also try to do some health marker analysis, right? The keywords analysis. We don't diagnose, we're not doctors, you know. I might be able to tell you to take an Advil for a headache, that's about it. But what we do is interpret some of the health information, which is not complete necessarily. We try to help you see some of the health information that's already in your DNA, right? Visualize it and tie it together with your admixture, if possible, in the case of triangulated segments, and to your relatives. So you can say, for example, like, oh, so actually, so in this example, this is in Spanish, because I had already done the presentation here with it's thalassemia is sickle cell. So on my great grandmother's side, they do carry sickle cell. And I was like, okay, so how and when, right? And I started to look at it. I was able to triangulate with relatives, and it's coming from my great grandmother. So from my great grandmother's mother. So my second great grandmother, and the segments are from Senegal, where we're sharing. So this sickle cell is coming from an ancestor that gave me admixture from Senegal, and it's in this family line, and I'm able to sort of see and piece. And this is only just one example. There are other things, and not necessarily a condition. Sometimes it could be a superpower. Who knows? You know. But the cool thing is that this we like to present that to people as well, so that they can see how their family tree has phenotypical ties to some of these markers, right? Whether they're things like sickle cell, things like lactose intolerance, right? Like, you know, like who do I blame for not being able to eat cheese at night, you know, or whatever else. And the cool stuff, the cool part is that all of this is 100% doable, and we try to present that. So as I mentioned, and I kind of keep highlighting, the history is one of the biggest things that pieces things together. We've had so many people come into the Dominican Republic from its foundation. I mean, first and foremost, the natives that were there were the primary source of people. We even had natives come in from other colonies, right? Both willingly and unwillingly. And we see some of that evidence sometimes in places like 23andMe. I've seen profiles where somebody may get Yucatan Peninsula for native with a very strong prediction. And this is where the history just kind of like ties in together. And as people in an island, you might think of not a lot of people going necessarily out, but the people who did come in came in from a lot of different places. You know, just to give you a kind of a coincidental, interesting anecdote. At one of my workplaces, I ended up being related to the office manager, who is Irish and Italian. And we were like, how did that happen? And for a second, and when we started digging through it, it's my maternal grandmother, and that's when I discovered my maternal grandmother has a very strong pattern of Irish matches in two segments in two different chromosomes. So this is the type of information that I'm mentioning that we like to present to people so that they can have a sort of full story of themselves, right? So from the perspective of history, of genealogy, and genetic analysis as well. So for example, like what would you get? What do we give you as a product? Like in BUSCAFAMILY, we essentially well, the first thing is a well-developed family tree. We all know the backbone of genealogy is a family tree, right? And this, as I mentioned before, Catholic records are like our savior when it comes to genealogy. We also have civil records. We're not very big on censuses, right? This is one thing that a lot of other communities do have to their advantage. We don't have, with the mismanagement sort of and the kind of lax attitude in the island, we didn't have a lot of censuses where people were named, so we don't know a lot of times who was living next door necessarily. But we based it a lot on baptisms, marriages, deaths. Also, like I said before, you got to make things work for you, right? So the endogamy sometimes is a great brick wall breaker with the dispensations. These, for example, I do have some that I've gathered, and some and I can get more, but they are generally still, unfortunately, in the Dominican Republic, they're housed in a sort of precarious condition. They're still inside one of the large archdioceses churches, in the Santo Domingo city, but unfortunately the care, like it's very like the papers are very thin, and I just kind of wish somebody went in and like digitized everything, like put a magic wand and just digitized it. But that is a great tool. And I'll mention just to highlight that very quickly, endogamy in the Dominican Republic and in every other place where the church had a say in that would have the person fill out paperwork on how they were related to their spouse, and not only how they were related. Sometimes you need a dispensation if you married if you married somebody who was related to your spouse, especially as a woman. I have an ancestor who married a cousin of her late husband, and she needed to get a dispensation, which helped me get to 1790, which is great. So also, as I mentioned previously, genetic genealogy, ties everything with the relatives, and it is a little tricky sometimes with Dominican genealogy because people are so interrelated. Like one of my biggest things is in ancestry, for example, the relatives in common are not necessarily a say-it-all because we're usually all in common. So it's not 100% helpful. It is cool. I like the new addition that they have, the Pro Tools, that helps quite a bit in interpreting. But triangulation is usually my methodology because triangulation is the only sure way especially when they're larger segments, to be able to tie this all together. And kind of at the end of this, what I like to do is I don't have an example necessarily right now, just because these are usually the ones that I've done are personal to set clients. But the report, all of this stuff, uh, I like to put it like for the person in a report that is in PDF in English or Spanish. Uh, the website is also actually in English or Spanish as well, buscafamily.com, which I'll mention. But essentially, the report, it has like a summary and a descriptive version of findings about your genetic genealogy. Obviously, full access to your family tree, links to highlighted relative profiles. I love the color scheme in Ancestry and in MyHeritage. I like to do that with profiles that I manage and kind of tell you, look, these are your, for example, a lot of times for us as African diasporans as well, it's really big to be able to find African relatives because the documentation is lacking, as in all colonies, right? The documentation is not very strong for those branches. So to be able to find genetic evidence and be able to tie it together to family lines is really, really important. So and generally, to be able to organize it in your profile is really helpful because when you do have matches in the future that are coming from other places, you're like, oh, this person is tied to this person because of that. Also, the map locations, very important for highlighting, and actually a little bit of homework as well, some history book, and other media recommendations of somebody who's either your immediate relative or your ancestor. Like for example, a friend of mine who uh, who wanted the service, in her case, she ended up being related to somebody who is a late televangelist in Oklahoma that migrated from Lebanon and migrated from Lebanon to New York, but his father also had children in the Dominican Republic, and so genetically tied to somebody who never left the U.S. That I know of, to the Dominican Republic, and the media is really cool to see as well, um of your relatives, and then obviously a Zoom session like I'm doing now to kind of go through it and describe it. Yeah, so if you guys have any questions, hopefully not concerns, but
No, those are great. Do you want to go ahead and take your screen down, and then anybody who has
yeah,
questions, you have more to share?
no, that's it.
Okay.
Oh, I think, sorry, give me 1 second. I
Mhm.
was gonna say for anybody who wanted to visit the website, this is the website. I just wanted to have it on screen.
Yeah.
Uh, buscafamily.com. And you find what package suits you best. We have something there called Tres Golpes, which is the most exhaustive research, which is everything, the genetic, the genealogy, and that little bit of a health add-on. Um, and we call it, just to give you a little background, we call those Tres Golpes because the national breakfast of the Dominican Republic is mashed plantains with eggs and fried salami, which is called the three hits because it hits it. It probably hits cholesterol too, but it's good.
It sounds sweet and salty and good.
Yeah, yeah. All right. and back to you guys.
Oh, that's fantastic. I wrote a couple of questions while
Hmm.
you were talking, but I want to make sure everybody gets a chance. So, Dana, Phil, Lacey, anybody, you got questions? Holler. Okay, I'm going to start us off while I'm waiting for them to think of them. Um, I wanted to know what your experience was with how does endogamy um, create a good thing or a difficult thing for you for how far back you can go with your DNA matches, because normally it's like 5 generations, maybe up to 7, if you're just like super lucky and there's a lot of people in that pool, but usually like around 5. What do you find in the Dominican Republic and Caribbean?
So with the endogamy, right? So if we look at it first from a genealogical perspective, with the dispensations, there are some communities that have so much endogamy that you're going to find dispensations for multiple ancestors, and that literally translates into being able to go back pretty far up to about on average, I would say about 1750,
Okay.
sometime in the mid 1700s. And if you have an exceptionally uh, uh, like well documented line because of the papers, you might be able to get to the late 1600s. You might be able to get that. Unfortunately, the actual Catholic records in the Dominican Republic for a lot of the towns don't usually surpass the 1800s. There's about 4 or 5 towns that do that you can get back uh, before the 1800s, but usually not much further than about 1740 is like the limit. Um, there are also multiple documents, just like so back to the endogamy part on the genetic side. It is very tricky because on the genetic side, you can never be sure that you're related via just a single side. It's usually more than one side. So what you end up doing is the more matches you can gather on the genetic side, the more you can be sure that that segment is from that ancestor. But also, it makes it very tricky to interpret the centimorgans, right? Because you might have a 30 centimorgan match that's actually related to you 3 times in 1725, right? And that might look like an 1820 approximate, for example, match, but it's not. But I find that yeah, that it can actually help you. It can also help solve. Just to add to your question, I think it can help solve sometimes mysteries for lines that are outside of the island. Right. So for inside the island, it might be a little bit of a cluster headache for a second. But if you have, for example, a Greek match or a cluster of Greek matches that are in segments that you know are endogamous segments, and actually you can sometimes look at them, Gen match has the are your parents related to, you can visualize endogamous segments. And you can say, oh, wow, so via this repeated line that's related in 1725, I have a Greek relative. So, you know, and adding one more thing, I find that endogamy also on the admixture level, it zooms in some of the admixture more than it is, right? So you might have a Filipino ancestor from when a lot of Asians went into Latin America in the 1600s, and that person could have arrived 1680, but that line has repeated so many times that you're, 0.9% East Asian, and you're
So
and
it
you're
makes
like,
it seem like you're more than you really are.
yeah, because it's coming from that one ancestor, but it's just being repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated, and that definitely escalates the percent to a point where you might, because some people divide it like in conventional genealogy, I would say it's like, you'll divide, you're like, yeah, that should be my fifth great grandmother. And just to give you another highlight, this is why a lot of Dominicans, if not all, have native ancestry because it's not coming from too many natives in general. It's not coming from hundreds of thousands of natives. It's coming from a small group that has been, I always tell people if you have a game and you're playing, with different colored balls, for example, and everybody has a couple of green ones and they pass them around, everybody's gonna end up with a green one. And that's kind of what you get. Yeah. So I think it genealogically, if you have dispensations, you can get back pretty decently far. Um, and if you don't have dispensations, it's the genetic genealogy might be able to help you figure out. But sometimes you will have, being very honest, you're gonna have lines where you're like, I can't go back before 1840, and I don't know how I'm related to this person so many times. But it's because also another thing you have is NPEs, obviously, and the NPEs are something to figure out and make sense of. Not
They
for
just
the
That's one of the reasons that a lot of people want to know about genetic genealogy, because they can't figure out where this non-parental event came from. But that's my grandpa or that's my great grandpa, and then you find out that it's not, that it's a non-parental event, that NPE becomes a problem for, trying to figure out everything else. And so within the Dominican Republic, that could be a huge problem with the dogamy.
Yeah, because it's another layer. I'll give you just a quick example. My grandmother, actually, when I tested her brother, first thing I noticed is that he was sharing 25% DNA, and I was like, that's not 50. That's not close to 50. So I looked at the empty DNA but more focused on the relatives really. And it definitely they're related maternally. I mean, it's a little harder to have a maternal non-parental event than a paternal one. So I was able to figure out, it took me years actually of waiting for the right amount of matches at the right stem organ, because another thing I can say is Dominican genealogy has advantages and it has disadvantages when it comes to the relatives, right? And that is that Dominican genealogy, and especially the genetic side, strongly based on Dominicans who immigrate to the United States, the whole island is well represented as far as immigration into the United States. Because obviously Ancestry and 23andMe don't sell directly to the Dominican Republic. So
Mm.
anybody who has been tested there usually you smuggle a DNA kit, in a bag or something. They don't. I mean, it's not against customs, but at the same time it means that the people who got here earliest, especially from certain towns in the center of the island, they are the most represented. So if you have a NPE and your ancestor is from that set of towns, you're gonna just log in one day and just find your uncle. Like that simple.
Eventually.
Yeah, eventually, and sometimes immediately because a lot of people have tested. But in the case of other towns that are less represented, who are people who have immigrated later in the 90s and the 2000s from like the southeast of the island, the northwest of the island, they're more preoccupied with like, building up and that back home. So, and they're not exposed because this is another flow, I would say, and this would be great. It's just a little like hint to 23andMe and Ancestry is they don't really advertise in Spanish, from what I've seen, right? My heritage actually is kind of taking the cake on that. My heritage is doing a lot of stuff in Spanish, so they're exposing people who might not have a lot of English proficiency to these tests. So in summary, for the NPEs, it is a bit tricky with the endogamy. Now, when you combine both, for my grandmother's case, just to give you the conclusion on that, I was able to. It did take me a few years. We're not from a town that's super represented. We're somewhere in the middle. And the first set of matches were like third to fourth cousins. They were consistent. I knew through who we were related, but that didn't give me any conclusion until she got a couple of closer relatives.
Oh,
And then
wow.
everything just fell into place. I mean, her late father lived about a mile and a half from my great grandmother. And
Wow.
my great grandmother was a pork, the pork rinds, the crunchy pork. She used to sell that in the streets. So she used to walk around these
Wow.
places, and she wasn't formally married either. Her brother, her other children's father had a lot of kids, which also this also makes it hard to trace sometimes. This was genetic. He had about 42 children, with about 7 or 8 women. So including my great grandmother. So it makes it difficult when it's that many people to but that's where the DNA kind of comes in and you can figure out, especially as you start to develop. I always tell people that when you can build these clusters, they're forever to keep, you know, because now you have identified a cluster of people that might come from an NP, for example, and you might be able to help somebody else.
Oh, that's pretty spectacular. I have a couple of other questions for you.
Mhm.
Of the destroyed records, like the cannon blasted ones or whatever, did they keep the fragments?
No, well, in some cases, yes. So and there are some cases where you have very bad quality records that you can view them online. You can kind of try to decipher. The Mormon Church did a great job, the Family Search, in digitizing these early. especially like in the 80s and the 70s. We've had no opposition to them coming in, so we don't have any issues there. Now, the ones that were, for example, we had a war between Spain and the Dominican Republic in 1863, and in that cannon blast, it went on fire. So fire, ashes,
Yeah.
and there
Um,
hasn't been a culture of preservation necessarily because the island was very, just to give you like a social sort of view, the island was sort of a little bit abandoned and people became great resilient countryside workers. So most people couldn't read or write like in my great grandfather's generation. But they were really good at resource management and producing food for themselves. So they weren't necessarily very focused on the preservation aspect. But nowadays that has changed so much. Kudos to for the Dominican government today that has done a lot of good job digitizing some of these, not just the Catholic records, but also some of the another source is also what they call those archivos reales, which are the real archives, as they call them in Spain. And those have some of the legal battles. Some of them are kind of funny, people slapping each other, or it could be something like a land sale. And these are very insightful to get more color into your ancestors' life. And also another one is we're actually just getting lawyer records from the 17 and the 1800s, which includes sometimes land sales, sometimes slave sales, and as far as property and movement of people. So it's really, it can only get better. Oh,
that's
And I'll add one thing. Sometimes we got lucky when the Spanish Empire had the habit of making double copies of things.
yeah.
So when stuff got sent back to Seville or to Madrid, it was like, yes. Because, in the case that it was destroyed in the island, it really, and some of these documents are, I mean, some of them are in great shape. Uh,
Yeah. The way
yeah,
that
so,
I proved my own grandfather's birth was even though his birth record was destroyed, the doctor had filed his copy. And
wow.
that way I had a proof of his birth in 1883. And that was, a big bone of contention within our family because somebody else on another line of the family was like, oh no, he was born in a different year. And it became a thing. But I was able to prove it when I found the doctor's records because it was a secondary, but the doctor had been present. So it
Oh,
was
wow.
right. So that was a really good thing. But um, let's see. The last question I had is probably silly, and it probably has to do with your own way that you were doing things. But I happened to notice you wrote December 5th greats on your records that you were showing.
Oh,
Was that a
descent.
discovery date, or was that something important?
No, I try to abbreviate with a limited space and for descendants of fifth great grandparents.
Oh, gotcha. I was like, DEC, December?
You,
Gotcha.
but that's one of the cool things, like for example, and this is where the genetic genealogy part comes in strong, is that being able to try, it's such a good feeling being able to triangulate somebody who's like a fifth great grandparent to like a single segment or a couple of segments, because you can sort of see what's happening there and from different points of views. And in Dominican genealogy, you can see it, and in all genealogies, really, you can see like the admixture, because that mixture isn't just. Sometimes people just think of African versus European versus Native versus Asian, but within the European spectrum, within the African spectrum, within the Asian, and within the Native spectrum, you kind of get to see some of the movement of people. And I mean, like I have a Cuban second great grandfather, and before 23andMe started to tell people the types of indigenous that they had, I knew I had indigenous Cuban because in GenMatch I had triangulated indigenous segments with my Cuban relatives, and I was like, there's only two options. Either I have Cuban native or they have Dominican native, or we both have native, three options. And so I already had that in my notes. So when they released that feature, I was like, confirmed, and also ancestry with the indigenous Cuba. I also get indigenous Cuba, for example, in those segments, and they line up with my Cuban relatives. Uh,
That's cool. Question on, you mentioned that Ancestry didn't sell into the Dominican Republic. Is there a reason?
I mean, I would have to check. I haven't
Or-
seen in the last 6 months, but initially, and at least as of last year, I checked, they don't sell directly. I know, like indirectly, yes. Like there are people who have like couriers that send stuff from
Mhm.
like a Miami address. And those, some people have ordered DNA through there, but I don't remember seeing it on the country list. They do add countries all the time. I mean, I remember with 23andMe, to give you an example, 23andMe wasn't selling to Spain back, I think, 2019, 2018. And a good friend of mine who's adopted from the Dominican Republic, I sent him a kit via snail mail to Spain. And he was able to, that gave him a couple of breakthroughs.
That is a
Uh,
great suggestion if that country is not being covered yet. 23andMe, we're all watching with, with bated breath because nobody knows exactly what's gonna, happen with them going forward. So that'll be an interesting thing. But with my heritage with so much that my heritage is doing and so much with ancestry and I think there's a lot of good mix there that you can get within that. Does my heritage sell into Dominican Republic?
I think they do. I think they do because I've seen some testers. I'm pretty sure they kind of cover all the gray areas. Like they sell to France, which a lot of people are afraid to sell to. Uh, they sell to all these places, and I do see it in the relatives. And one thing that I noticed, and I was like, uh-huh. There's a channel called Univision, which is a common Latino channel, 41, I think it is, in the antenna. And they had a segment with a TV personality called La Chiqui Bombón. And that TV personality actually had it was like a Finding Your Roots,
Mhm.
like Univision version, and My Heritage was a sponsor
Nice. I love
for
it.
that. And they were like, "This is your fourth great grandparent." She actually had roots in the United States. From the in the 1820s, we had a group of about 2,000 African Americans settle in the north side of the island. She's a descendant from there. But in any case, My Heritage really stepped up their game into like filling in those gaps when it came especially because the language barrier, I think, to be very honest, here in the northeast of the United States, people who are recently here, like my cousins, they don't necessarily, it's going to take them a few years to get the hang of English, and the stuff they're watching online is usually not in English.
Mm.
um so they're not really exposed, it's not like, like, so my friends that are born and raised here, Dominican Americans, on the other hand, very proficient in English, and they could have just turned on YouTube one day and played a song and like, oh, 23andMe, and the most complete. But yeah, there's also some cool projects, I would say, not, apart from My Heritage. FTDNA also sells to the Dominican Republic. They've always been very international.
Very good.
Family Tree DNA. They sell to Brazil. They sell to Guyana. They sell to so many different places. And I'm actually also part of a project there, the Dominican Genealogy project in FTDNA, where we're trying to get the uniparental markers, which is also part of the analysis that I like to do. And we're trying to add in some notable connections in there, like some of the founding fathers of the countries, Y-DNA. We have the Y-DNA of one so far, and it's from Senegal,
Oh, wow.
one of the founding fathers.
Absolutely fascinating. Well, unless there's any other questions, I don't want to cut off anybody, but I want to thank you so much for your time. And Gerald, would you tell us one more time, how do we find your company online?
Yes, yeah, you go to www.buscafamily.com, BUSCAFAMILY.com.
And do you work with genealogists who maybe find that their client has different genealogy that they're used to researching? Can they then hire you as a sub to their project?
Yeah, certainly, certainly. I've actually worked even with Ancestry Pro genealogists as well. They've for some of the cases.
Oh,
So I'll definitely take on. Yeah.
that's good to know. So what we want to do is thank you for being with us, and we will make sure that we make this available wide for as many people who can see it. And we thank you so much, Gerald, for being with us. Stick with us right after we close out of our recording. And for those of you who've never heard of the Institute before, we are the International Institute of Genealogical Studies, and you can find us at genealogicalstudies.com. You can learn more about DNA and genetic DNA and get your own certifications with us, or you can also go on and learn other country of origin records. So come and visit us at genealogicalstudies.com, and thank you, Gerald Lopez, for being with us today.
Thank you, Angela.